Warm greetings to all of you. Thank you for coming back, although it's still sunny outside. And we're just about to kick off with a second session. I'm Cláudia Pazos Alonso. I'm the current tutor for women. And I think we can all agree that women are a positive force for good, as we found out in the previous session. Now we're going to tackle the gender and power in higher education session. And we wish to focus on progress over the last 50 years, but also the challenges that still persist today. Historically, the founding of Somerville and LMH in the late 19th century provided very much needed women-only spaces, where women were role models as the norm rather than the exception. At Wadham, with the long overdue implementation of the co-educational model, female students were initially in a minority, as we know. And also, they had to navigate college life without any female fellows as potential mentors or role models, until the appointment of Christina Howells, as we know, and then Tao Tao Liu and Jane Garnett. So this is a kind of trio that kick-started women as fellows. Today, there is an almost complete gender parity within our student body. In fact, there's slightly more women undergraduates, and we heard this morning that this is also true at university level. There is near parity at the level of college lecturers. But at fellowship level, however, there was only a significant improvement after the dawn of the new millennium. Wadham now has just over 1/3 of female fellows, which means that nearly two-thirds are still men. So there's clearly still a leaky pipeline. And this is one of the challenges that remain in terms of gender and power in higher education. And this is before we look at the distribution of gender across subject areas, or indeed the awarding gap, and where Oxford remains well out of line with other universities up and down the country, as we heard in the session this morning. And then there's also questions around race, class, disability. Actually, I do want to say that one thing that Wadham has done is that in addition to having a tutor for women, we have a tutor for race, and we have a tutor for equality and diversity. And actually, the figures suggest that we're not doing badly at all on disability and race. In fact, we're above in terms of attainment, we're well above the university average. To reflect on this landscape, past and present, we are delighted to be joined by our 4 panelists. And I'll just go through them in order. Professor Jane Garnett, Dame Sally Mapstone, Karmjit Kaur, Professor Ursula Martin. It is a privilege to be hosting such an accomplished and inspirational range of Wadham women. And I shall only say a few words because you want to hear from them, not me. Jane is currently the Senior Fellow at Wadham, one of the pioneers along Christina and Tao Tao. She went on to serve as Senior Tutor, Sub-Warden and Welfare Dean. Her impact on the college, through tireless service to the Wadham community, has been transformational, helping to expand and normalise the range of positions of power that women have been able to occupy in college since the 1970s. At university level, amongst many roles, she served as the first humanities EDI lead. I'll come back to Dame Sally for reasons which will become clear in a second. Karmjit came up precisely 20 years ago to read PPE in 2004. She is currently Deputy Head at Universities UK, where she leads the Political Affairs team. And she brings to the panel expertise as the co-founder of Lowdown, a platform which offers career mentoring and advice for women and minorities. And we particularly look forward to you sharing your insights and expertise with us. Ursula Martin, CBE, is an Emerita Fellow of Wadham College, and it is worth noting that when she was appointed Professor of Computer Science at the University of St Andrews, she was only the second female professor ever at the entire university. So interesting. I'm sure things have changed since. Yeah, I'm sure. She's a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, and we're very pleased to hear about what she has to say, especially regarding women in science. And last but not least, Dame Sally is one of our honorary fellows. As you know, she was part of the second cohort of women in 75. An English literature scholar and a fellow of St Hilda's. She went on to serve as proctor and then pro-vice-chancellor at the University of Oxford. These are important university-wide roles. She is currently principal and vice-chancellor at the University of St Andrews, and other leadership roles include serving as the current president of Universities UK. And at this point, I should like to hand over to her shortly because Dame Sally has kindly agreed to set the scene on the topic of women's role in higher education with her insights into the past and present situation. And after her intervention, I will ask each of the other panelists to respond, to offer their responses to her. And we will continue in dialogue. And in the last final bit of the session, we will open the questions to the floor and elicit contributions from all of you. So thank you very much, and over to you, Sally.
Thanks very much, Claudia. And let me first of all say it's just such a pleasure to be back in Wadham once again, and a real honour to share this panel with two such distinguished female fellows of the college, an Emeritus Fellow and my colleague Karmjit. We've been working very closely together for Universities UK for the past year, and as you heard, Karmjit is also a distinguished PPE alumna. So I'm going to set the scene a bit, just looking rather briskly over some of the key issues in relation to 50 years since women came up to Wadham and colleges went mixed, as we used to call it, in Oxford. And the things I think I'm going to focus on have actually started to emerge in the panel that the Vice-Chancellor chaired this morning and some of our conversations today. So what are the key issues if we look at what has made a difference, what has enabled progress? And for me, they are very much centred on visibility, critical mass, and key interventions. So if we start back in 1974, I think one of the key things to remember, which I confess it had slipped from my mind, but I'm very grateful to Anya Dixon from the 1974 cohort, who had somehow actually managed to preserve the typewritten document from the early 1970s in which these facts are incarcerated. And this document that Anya sent on to me reminded us that for the first 5 years in which women were admitted to the mixed colleges, there was a cap on the number of women who were admitted, and there was a cap across the 5 colleges of 100 women. So for the first 5 years, 74 to 79, generally only about 25 women could be admitted at each of the colleges. Now, this was obviously to, if you like, take some of the pressure off, the strain off the existing colleges for women. But what it did do, of course, was to ensure that women were represented at the mixed colleges, but they weren't represented in huge numbers. Now, and I think we need to think about the knock-on effects of that, the implications of that, both, if you like, psychologically as well as numerically. Now, as Claudia said, if you go forward now, overall in Oxford, you've got more female students than male students. You've got more female undergraduates than male undergraduates. You've actually got more male graduates than female undergraduates. And then if you start looking at the representation of women in academia, Again, there are still some significant gaps, and Oxford as a whole remains at the lower end of the scale. It doesn't have proportionately the same number of female academic staff as you might find in some of the other UK universities. So we should feel, rightly, I think, that we have come a very long way in 50 years. And I certainly feel that when I look back across my own career. But it would be a very, very big mistake to think that it is to use the cliche, a level playing field. And there is absolutely no grounds for sort of complacency or taking things for granted. And when you start to look, and Cláudia, I think, was indicating this, and Karmjit may want to say even more about it, when you start to look at issues of intersectionality, the imbalances are still really severe. So what makes a difference? Visibility, and to some extent, I would also say audibility. And this is where also critical mass can make a difference. Where have you seen real progress in higher education, women breaking through, making a difference? It's when they've been visible, when they've been audible, and when you've been able to see them in a critical mass. Now, I'm going to give one slightly anecdotal example of this from my own career, which might, in a way, be seen to be almost sort of arguing against the value of mixed colleges. But stay with me for a bit, because I just want to explain what I'm getting at here. I had a wonderful undergraduate career at Wadham. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now if I hadn't gone to Wadham. I'm completely convinced of that. It changed the way I thought about English literature and virtually everything else. And it gave me a skill set, as we heard people talking this in the earlier session, that was transformative. But I actually spent the majority of my career in Oxford as a fellow of St Hilda's College, which until 2008 was the last remaining college for women. So I had a real comparison to make in my career. And I confess, when I first went to St Hilda's, where Jane and I were there together as junior research fellows, I had this sort of rather excited sense that I was going to Mallory Towers or somewhere of that sort. And I wasn't totally disappointed, actually. I was astonished to find when I first moved into Hall Building and opened the window in my room that there was a sort of set of equipment hanging from the window ledge. And I asked my scout what that was, and she said, "Oh, that's what you use if there's a fire." You were supposed to sort of abseil down the side of the building, which was sort of, again, rather exhilarating but rather alarming. And I was working with Celia Seisman, a distinguished medievalist, who, when we did admissions, would say, well, she'd write next to the name of the woman we'd been interviewing, GVG. And I'd say, "What does that mean, Celia?" And she'd say, "Good, vigorous girl." So that was sort of what we were supposed to be admitting at St Hilda's. But having said all that, there was a period in the 1990s when, for a number of years in English, the women at St Hilda's got the best results across the entire university. We had about 2 or 3 years, generally there'd be about 12 women in the year, where really staggering numbers of women were getting first, like 9 or 10 of them. And this caused consternation in Christchurch and 1 or 2 other colleges who were used to performing very well and who generally made jokes about St Hilda's like it was the Virgin Megastore and things of that sort. Not funny, but that's what was said. Or isn't it a secretarial college? So there was real interest in why was it that women were doing so well. And as one of the English tutors there, to me, I thought the answer was actually very clear. Women were doing very well because they could see other women doing very well. And they were being taught by a group of women who told them to aim high and that they could do it. They could do whatever they wanted to do. And the cohort effect, the visibility effect, the role modeling effect was absolutely palpable in that cohort of women. They believed in themselves because they believed in other women. They'd seen themselves do it, if you know what I mean. So to me, that was actually very instructive. As I say, it's not an argument for saying you must have single-sex colleges, but it does teach you about the value in an unequal system of actually having that cohort effect and having those significant role models. So I continue to think that that's where, if you like, I think interventions are occasionally really important. Throughout my career at Oxford and now also at St Andrews, I have taken the view that you can't just leave things as they are. You do need on occasion to make really significant interventions that actually mix things up, that change things, that move them on. Otherwise, we will just sort of make very gradual progress and not get that much further. Why do I think this is so important? Well, I'll give you another example from my own career. As Cláudia mentioned, I started my leadership career in Oxford as proctor. I was junior proctor for 1 year, and that's where you wear sub-fuss for a year, and you're supposed to be a tribune of the people, and you work with the vice-chancellor. I was very much in the minority in terms of gender in the senior team there. And I have to say, I laboured under one significant problem, which was that then Vice-Chancellor John Hood was a New Zealander. And this had the effect that for the entire year, because of his accent, he referred to me as silly. And it's kind of hard to communicate the diminishing effect of this when we'd be in senior team meetings and the Vice-Chancellor would say, well, I suppose we'd better see what Silly's got to say. And it's not a good way into sort of giving a kind of learned viewpoint. But the other thing that happened, I found, when I started first as Pro-Vice-Chancellor, I became Pro-Vice-Chancellor for People and Equality. And I would frequently be in meetings in the senior team. There'd be 17 people in the room, and I was the only woman. And when the meeting was over, mostly they'd troop off to guess where, the toilets. And loud gales of laughter would emerge. Well, clearly, subjects were being discussed that I was, no pun intended, not privy to, because I was in splendid isolation in the ladies. And then I would find that decisions had been taken or arguments had moved on that genuinely I had not been a part of. So what do you do about that? And this is actually where audibility comes in. I did used to say on occasion, actually, do you know, I think this isn't really totally acceptable, that we seem to have decided something somewhere else where I've not been part of. And occasionally you need to intervene, you need to make people feel a bit uncomfortable, and you need to indicate, you know, how you want to do things properly. But what that experience also really reinforced to me was the huge importance of actually trying to move things along and intervening and making a difference. So one of the things that I did when I was Pro-Vice-Chancellor was to introduce a mentoring scheme for senior women in Oxford, professional staff and academic staff, and it was given sort of classic Oxford Latinate title of ad feminam, but the aim behind it was to say to women, you have a range of life choices at crucial stages in your life. How can the institution actually help you to make the best decisions? So this wasn't about saying that everybody should want to have a major leadership position, but it was saying women have a range of choices that can be extremely challenging to them, and to give them the opportunity to play out those choices with a mentor who's not going to tell them what to do, but who is effectively going to listen and to say, well, you could go on and do this, have this research career, you could go on and run your department, what would make a difference to you? That scheme was novel in Oxford, and I think it did make a difference. I've done something very similar in St Andrews, because what we're trying to do there is to open up this pipeline and to make sure that we're not losing women at those crucial stages, going through from that early career stage, then on to the senior level, that women actually make the choices that they should be making because they understand the range and they feel supported by the institution. I'm going to finish with one reference to one intervention by not me, but another Sally. And forgive me, those of you who heard me mention this morning in the Vice-Chancellor's session. But it's a striking example of how, on occasion, you can have an intervention in the area of gender that makes a manifest and lasting difference. And I think it's the sort of thing we should all really think about. So in 2011, Dame Sally Davis, who was then the Chief Medical Officer, wrote an extraordinary letter to the Medical Schools Council in which she said, I've just been reviewing grant applications in relation to the National Institute of Health Research, and I'm really shocked by the lack of attention to diversity in our medical schools. So I'm giving you notice that from 2 years from now, any application for NHIR funding, and this for many institutions, including Oxford, this was hundreds of thousands of pounds, will not be accepted unless the department that is applying has an Athena Swan Silver Award. And for those who don't know, Athena Swan, it's a recognition scheme for women in academia that is awarded at institutional and departmental level. And it's about significant cultural change. You can't get it unless you've made a really significant cultural shift. And what she was effectively doing in one move was linking together funding and gender equality. It was an amazingly effective intervention. I was still in my PVC role, and I started getting texts from the head of our medical sciences division saying, how do we get an Athena Swan Platinum Award? Not that such a thing existed, but this was indicative of a degree both of panic and a wish to do something about it. And I think we do sometimes have to ask ourselves, do we need to make those culturally disruptive interventions to move things along? For me, on occasion, the answer is absolutely yes, but they have to be well chosen and you need to know that they're going to be effective.
Thank you very much for this laying out the picture so clearly in terms of the benefits and the costs, in fact, of going mixed, which are often not, that figure of 25 a year is certainly very striking. Yeah. Could I please ask for responses? Jane, would you like to follow on?
Thank you, Sally. Yes, I mean, listening to what you were saying, I mean, it's so, obviously, this is, you know, we parallel careers in some sense in terms of our generational. I was at St Anne's from 1977, so I had an experience of being an undergraduate in a single-sex college, and St Anne's certainly, in a way, suffered in the short term from the creaming off of, you know, the best women students into the mixed, you know, so-called mixed colleges. So I saw it, I suppose, from the other end of the telescope. But you know, these things have changed over time, and we're now, you know, from that point of view, I think in a much more normalized, numerically normalized situation, and people, in a sense, forget aspects of the history, probably quite, you know, helpfully. I suppose what I think about a lot is the degree to which, in certainly the first period that I was in Oxford, I felt, perhaps because I was at a single-sex college, but I think actually probably because of the time period and the other things that were going on, I felt that I, as a woman, could do anything. I didn't feel I was often in a minority in Oxford as a whole, but I felt that, you know, that opportunities were there. Actually, there was nothing to stop people, you know, achieving what they wanted to achieve. And I've become more and more radicalized and more feminine, more and more of a feminist as time has gone on. And I've become, over the arc of my time teaching in Wadham, I suppose there've been periods when I was first here in the late 80s, I think, when students, and there are some here today, and who were very radicalized and were very frustrated by some aspects of exercise of gendered power in a way that disadvantaged women, were very active in speaking up and, you know, campaigning on that front. There was then a period, ironically, of course, I mean, but perhaps predictably, when things all seemed rather rosy in Wadham, and there were more women than there were men undergraduates. Wadham seemed a halcyon world in which, you know, anything could be done. You know, women had as much voice as anybody else. You know, everybody felt completely. I mean, not everybody, but there was a sense of, I think, there being less of a need to be radical, and I've at that point felt frustrated with some of my students. I said, look, you get outside this little bubble, and you'll find that you actually need to be a bit more resourceful and think a little bit harder about what stratagems are going to be necessary to get on in the world. And then, of course, these things go up and down. And I suppose the point I just want to make really is that it's not as in all other contexts, there isn't a linear progressive development. I mean, these things come and go, and people are alert to problems of gender at certain moments more than they are at other moments. And of course, the point about intersectionality, again, there's a tendency for people to think of those sequentially. So there's a notion we've dealt with gender, we'll now move on to race or disability or any of the other protected characteristics. And I think the resistance to thinking intersectionally has been quite striking. I mean, partly because it's more convenient in a way for institutions to think in that sort of way. And I suppose, sorry to be long-winded about this, coming to the point that seems to me to be worth our addressing in terms of power, gender and power in higher education, is the point about defining what power is and how power should be exercised. Because I think my sense is that when the first 5 male colleges went mixed, and in general, there was then obviously a process of change whereby the women's colleges also went mixed, and again, in numerical terms, things changed. Nobody was really thinking hard enough about what the implications of that would be in terms of a different perspective on power, full stop. What difference it would make to have different models of collaboration, different ways of thinking about the whole of a professional life and the relationship between having a family, not having a family, thinking about work-life balance, thinking about just how you might think about work. And I think there was not enough radical questioning of what the positive implications might be and the complexities of that development. And one of the just straws in the wind on that front was that when I started teaching in the mid-1980s, there were a group of us who were called the Women Tutors Group. And that showed in a way that we felt a need to be somehow in some sort of solidarity with each other. And out of that Women Tutors Group was born the Master's course in Women's Studies, which has become Master's course in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, which has been hugely influential and has actually had not an official connection with Wadham, but an unofficial connection with Wadham, and Cláudia and I have been working for that programme since the beginning. And that's, I think, been a really interesting context within which people have been able to ask quite radical questions about intersectionality and about the nature of power, if you like, and how thinking about gender might actually help to transform that definition, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying is so pertinent, because I think it's a classic example, isn't it? You make one change to the system on the grounds that you're actually doing something for equality, but you don't actually really think of the knock-on effects. And those making their way through then find that they're essentially having to work with a system that reflects the old ways of being. And I think we still inherit a lot of that in higher education. Again, I think there are things that one can do, and sometimes they can seem disruptive, but if they're within the law, they're worth doing. So, for example, at my institution, I see the shortlists that come through for academic jobs, and if they're single sex, we send them back and say, come on, have another go at that. It's inconceivable that there isn't somebody who we could go after who could be shortlisted. And sometimes it's actually very interesting to ask, well, what was the process that lay behind it? And you can possibly guess where this goes on occasion. So I think you have still to be prepared to make those challenges and ask those questions. And Ursula, I mean, I'm sure you could speak about these issues ad infinitum from the from the computer science perspective.
Yes, the trouble is, if you switch me on, it's hard to switch me off. But maybe we should. Maybe you should have a chance.
I've been trained well by Sally, so I will be concise, don't worry. I wanted to just start by picking up on 2 elements of Sally's opening remarks, and that's on intersectionality and role models, and unsurprisingly, mentoring, given my current role. And I think on intersectionality, I think, like Jane said, that's where there are still some challenges. We've made some great progress in terms of female representation in HE, which looks similar to a lot of other industries and sectors. But actually, I'm still disputing the exact figure, but when we look at University UK members, which is the overwhelming majority of vice-chancellors across the UK, I can only think of one woman who is black and a leader of a higher education institution. According to one statistic, out of 23,000 professors, only 61 are black women. And from my personal experience arriving at Wadham 20 years ago, I would say I felt seen as a woman. I didn't feel seen as a woman of colour, and I would say, and it's not a protected characteristic, I didn't feel seen as a woman of colour from a working class background. And that's one thing that I can think quite often sits in the background that isn't addressed in the same way that protected characteristics are, particularly at institutions that are considered still to be quite elite, like Oxford and Cambridge. And I think on role models, I was really pleased to hear Sally's comments around mentoring and introducing those mentoring programs across different universities. And I think that's incredibly important. And the work that I do at the Lowdown focuses on we focus on career coaching and mentoring, but what I refuse to do is executive coaching, particularly because that is still male dominated, and I don't really have much interest in like giving Colin even more confidence. It's actually kind of female, like those who have recently graduated, especially recently when they graduated during a time when they studied during COVID, which could impact their confidence and the way that they could advocate for themselves even further. And even now, you see them going into these roles, into the corporate world, into the public sector, on kind of more junior roles than they should be, on less pay that they should be. And I think that mentoring is important, and I do think there's still a role for colleges and universities to continue to coach and mentor female graduates well beyond, I think, graduation. It's actually something that we're looking at Universities UK, whether that careers service provision should actually extend kind of 5 years beyond graduation rather than just in the run-up to you graduating. And I think it's incredibly important when you get to the top of your industry or even your role not to pull up the ladder. Because I was thinking about working almost a decade in higher education in roles such as those at Universities UK and thinking, actually, we have come a long way because I have fewer and fewer instances of sexism, fewer instances of microaggressions, and that made me at first think, well, that means things have gotten better. But what else has happened in that decade? I've become more senior. I understand the system more. I've actually got excellent mentors, including Sally in the sector, where I think if someone knows that I'm associated with Sally, they wouldn't dare treat me unequally. And so have things gotten better, or do I just feel more empowered? Am I more senior? I have more hiring power across places like Universities UK, where it's probably no coincidence that the 3 most senior people in my team are women and 2 are women of colour. And that goes back to what Sally was saying around visibility, and actually someone starting out in that sector, whether it's higher education, whether it's in an academic post or in a corporate role, might not feel like that. So remember that, remember how you felt when you were at that stage of your career, and make sure that you support that pipeline of women coming through.
Yes, actually, you've just got me thinking, how did I feel when I first walked through the doors of Girton College, Cambridge? So I'm the interloper, kind of. I was an undergraduate in Cambridge in the year that some Cambridge men's colleges, former men's colleges, admitted women, or yes, went mixed as we used to call it, which was 1972, 2 years ahead of Oxford. I didn't apply to any of them because my school told me, no, you won't get in, don't do that. What? So I was condemned to 3 years of cycling down the Huntingdon Road with one, I think it used to be roughly 1 cycling death a year on that. Does anyone know Cambridge, that bloody Huntingdon Road? They've improved it since. But I went to read mathematics where I was in a minority. And actually, Cambridge mathematics had this huge extra factor. Cambridge, there's this personality type in UK mathematics, world mathematics, called the mathematician from Trinity, Cambridge. You know, it's a bit like the Prime Minister from Eton, that sort of thing. It's that sort of air they have to them. And surprise, surprise, you know, they are universally male. And when I was an undergraduate, that was actually, it sort of ground everybody else into the dust, not just the women, that sense of elitism given to a particular college, which doesn't happen, I think, so much in Oxford anywhere. But But I think this thing of visibility, it can be awfully wearing sometimes, being visible. You know, St Andrews is a small town. I bet Sally can't go into Tesco's without somebody. Somebody
Object of intense fascination, but that's, you know, I don't think that's gender specific. It's
yes,
just very
that,
few.
but yes, you get this kind of visibility, this kind of, it can be incredibly wearing. And I imagine looking at the, you know, the names and the dates on here, many women had that thing of being the first woman, the only women, one of the few women. And one of the things about moving to a situation of critical mass, it doesn't have to be a majority. It's, you know, if it's, I'm now in Oxford Maths, where 10% of the professors are female. 10% is not a lot, but it's a big department. So there's about 20 of us. And suddenly, you're not the woman. Guess what? We don't all agree on everything. And that in itself is hugely liberating. But also this sense, I think, of being in a largely male discipline. Of course, you learn to survive, and sometimes you learn to survive with character traits. You think later in life, oh, yeah, I do behave that way because I've spent a hell of a lot of my life around aggressive men, you know. And if necessary, I can go back and turn on the aggression. You find yourself in a group of aggressive men and you come out with the razor sharp, rather rude response. Somebody said, "You're awfully rude there." And then I think, well, actually, that's the way I've learned to be. But you don't necessarily end up feeling happy about being that way. I then moved into computer science, which has, interestingly, computer science, when it started off, it didn't have a woman problem. Well, it did have a woman problem. Or too many of them. And Robert, sitting there, is an expert on the early days of Bletchley Park, which had huge numbers of women working there, often forgotten, often not because of official secrets acts and so on, not talking about what they did. A lot of women went into computing in the early days of the civil service. The public sector gradually got pushed out. Women's skills got devalued. Women undergraduates were in the majority in computing in the 70s and 80s and got pushed out. Why? Because men sort of seized the power. It became apparent, you know, this was somewhere where you could earn a lot of money. And these low-key power moves, they look like low-key power moves, but they're people subtly taking the power. Karmjit and I were just talking about the high-tech sector, universities developing startups. How many of those are all male? If there are women involved, they're gently pushed. I mean, when I say gently pushed, what I mean is they often don't notice it's happening to them for exactly the reasons you said. They're pushed into the roles where they get less equity in the company. They're pushed into the subsidiary roles. Interventions, Sally mentioned interventions. Can you intervene? Of course you can. Some of the most radical programs for bringing women into computer science have happened in US universities, US private universities, where they're allowed to do things very, very differently. They can, you know, as you know, in the UK, we're in a state university system. We all have to do admissions roughly the same way. We're all judged by roughly the same league tables, of which neither Oxford or Cambridge are top this week. St Andrews is top. But that pushes onto university managers. I can say this because I was not quite as exalted as Sally, but I was one once too. And it pushes you in certain directions, and you stop and think about the unexpected consequences of these. And you think, actually, should we be doing it that way? Maybe not. Could we do this different thing? Well, we could, but we might edge from, I was in university management, in a university that bopped around at about somewhere between 17 and 25, you know. If we did that, we might go up to 14, or we might go down to 29. So we would fret ridiculously about these details when we could, in principle, have done radical things, but we lacked the nerve to do them. And then I see all this happening again with AI. Here we are. We had AI mentioned in the previous session. A new thing that's coming into every area of life. If ever there's something where you needed diverse perspectives, you know, you've got AI systems that can analyze scans, for example. Does as much money go into analysing breast cancer scans as other kinds of scans? No, it doesn't. Are women on the team in deciding the allocation of that funding? No, probably not. It happens everywhere, even in the esoteric research world I'm now in, of looking at how AI will affect mathematics. Well, suddenly, all those young men at Trinity are now old men of my sort of age, and suddenly they're the instant experts on AI. Hey, what? How did that happen? What about me? You have to be. It's the way in which one constantly has to. I'm meant to be sounding upbeat, aren't I? And I'm not. It's the way in which.
That's the question.
Yes, it's the way in which one constantly has to keep watching, keep seeing what's happening, keep thinking about it, keep thinking about the effects of gender, the effects of power. Well, we would like to be in a better place than we are. In some ways, we are in a terrific place, but there's still a lot to do.
Thank you, Ursula. I think it's important, you know, this idea that you're raising of, you know, remaining vigilant and never becoming complacent, because progress can backslide, you know, in no time. I think is really, I think it chimes with the message that was that we want to carry. I'm going to ask one question, my prerogative as the facilitator of the session, and then I shall open it to the floor. But if I could come back to you, Karmjit, what I'd really like to ask is if there was any interventions that would make a difference. So you've already suggested this, you know, mentoring beyond graduation. And I think there might already be something that exists, because I seem to recall the previous warden chairing a session. Do you remember, Jane? I think that it was something, but I can't remember the details. So anyway, would you see it more effective at college level or at university? I mean, would a smaller pilot be more effective than rolling it out?
I think however you do it, I think you just need to make sure that the focus and the resource is at the individual level. So what I found in terms of the interventions that we do, whether we do kind of online training, workshops, it's those one-to-one individual conversations that actually have the most impact, and those are the things that people remember and the impact that they have those lives. There's absolutely no disrespect to the kind of wider like resources. Like I deliver lots of workshops. Sadly, the most popular one for women is overcoming imposter syndrome. But it's actually that one-to-one individual advice, whether that program is university-wide, whether it's college-wide, I think is what is most impactful. I gave an example earlier during the refreshments to Sally, where one woman I was coaching was so delighted that she was and grateful that she was given the job that she asked for. She didn't ask about her pay. And she's accepted the job not even knowing if she's got a pay increase. And the impact that you can have on that person's life is that time that you take to have the individual conversation about this is how you get a pay increase. So whatever it looks like, make sure it's personal.
Thank you very much. Well, you've given us food for thought. I don't know if you want to come in here.
No, I was just going to say that I think it's so important to stress the role that mentoring can play, because, I mean, Sally introduced the ad feminam scheme when she was in Oxford, and that slightly lost momentum afterwards, and it wasn't. There weren't enough people around to sustain the notion that it was a really crucial part of the university's offering. And when I was the EDI lead for the humanities division, I introduced a separate sort of scheme, which was not a million miles from Ad Feminam, but differently constructed, called Career Conversations, which was intended to be something very open-ended, not related to peer review or career review or whatever, but something simply offering people an opportunity to identify somebody that they could talk to about their career. And very interestingly, the majority of people who've signed up for that, I think, have been women in mid-career who never had at any point had anybody mentoring them or actually talking to them about what was important in their careers. And just the very fact of having a conversation, being taken seriously, having an hour of your life when you could talk about yourself and what was good and what was bad and what your ambitions were, was actually an invaluable thing. And that's carrying on. But these things don't necessarily have very good sustainability within the university structures.
Well, you have to commit, don't you, actually? And you've got to commit in a sustained way. I was actually just going to mention something else. I'll tell you what got me really started in mentoring was actually when I was at Wadham, and it was in association with St Anne's. And St Anne's and Wadham women got together to offer consciousness-raising groups. I don't know if anybody else here remembers those, but my group, which was a mix of women from 4 or 5 women from Wadham and St Anne's, really created a sort of sisterhood, and the feeling that you could just knock ideas about anything around with your peer group. And I am very conscious that I've sort of replicated that throughout my life because it was so effective. I look for that sisterhood, and I suspect quite a lot of women of our generation do that.
It's a smaller example, and I've only read about it briefly, so I don't know if it's specific to women, but even the Wadham intervention on the Dorothy Wadham travel grants, I think is actually important in terms of just broadening people's horizons and not assuming that women have already done this. I know when I was at Wadham, it wasn't gender specific, but I did the Sarah Lawrence exchange programme. And because of my background, it was the first time I'd ever travelled abroad without a family member. And it was my only opportunity actually to travel independently. So I think those specific interventions are also important.
I agree. Travel broadens the horizons. You're talking to a linguist, so definitely. Okay, I think we'll open it to the floor, and I think there might be some roving microphones, or we've got surrender hours. Yes, Amelia.
Thank you. That was so interesting. I'm really struck by the figure of Wadham's fellows being 2/3 men and 1/3 women, which I think is really striking given how thoughtful the college has been about this issue. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about what the leaky pipeline issues are, and also to your point, Jane, about not asking enough radical questions about work-life balance, whether that's something to do with it. Although I kind of hate the idea that it has to be women who are thinking about those issues, and would love it to be kind of pushed over to the male academics to think more about their work-life balance.
Well, I think that's, in a way, precisely the point. I mean, I think that until it's actually thought about as a general issue rather than a women-specific issue, I mean, it's rather like we were talking about in the last panel about concerns about childcare. While that's seen as a woman's problem, then I think nothing is going to change. I mean, I think it does have to be much more radical. I think, there are all sorts of reasons why, individual appointments are not made, but I still think and I think it more and more that there are quite radical radically in the opposite sense. I mean, quite radicated assumptions still about the exercise of power, about the ways in which people articulate opinions, the ways in which people present themselves, which do actually affect people's decisions. I mean, there's a famous New Yorker cartoon from decades ago, with the boardroom. I'm sure everybody knows it, and the tagline is, "That's a really excellent point, Miss So-and-so. Perhaps one of the men would like to make it now," and the number of women that I know in positions of quite significant leadership who've had exactly that experience, and who've been in rooms where you were talking about audibility and visibility, where points have been made, they've not been taken up, they've been presented by somebody else, and then off it goes into a different. And I think that's something which is still a problem, and I think it needs to be sort of raised to the surface and talked about in a way much more than. I mean, you were talking about the girls, the admissions,
Good, vigorous girls.
the good, vigorous girls. My former colleague Cliff, whom many of you will know, had a category which was the category of the cheeky chap, and that was what he was looking for in a. And actually, Cliff, of course, as in so many ways, was very radical actually in his views, and he was very supportive of women. And he very, I mean, in some ways rather eccentrically, but he transferred the category of the cheeky chap to being gender neutral, and it wasn't a bad category really, but it required thinking about what it was to be challenging. Yes. Across the gender spectrum, if you like, and to be moving out of thinking in binary terms as well. And that would help.
Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned Cliff. He was my tutor. And very grateful to him for his thinking out of the box in some ways. But you just touched on something which has been playing on my mind when you mentioned non-binary. Because, I mean, from my conversations with my children and their generation, they are moving very much towards thinking in non-binary terms. So, and at some point, are these conversations about gender and race? I mean, they tend to put people into boxes, right? I have biracial children. Other people probably have bisexual children. I mean, so what? Where are we going with that, and what are the implications?
So I think it's a very good question, and I think it's a really important one, precisely because, as you say, in many ways, it is a very generational one. And it's one that I talk about with my own students at St Andrews a great deal, because it's, I would have to say, until the Israel-Gaza war came along, the whole question of the trans debate in particular was the one that was on our campus by far the most challenging, because it polarizes people in all sorts of ways, ethically, generationally. But I think the key thing is to ensure that everybody actually does feel they can talk about these issues and talk about them respectfully and work them through. What I've found, I do quite frequent roundtables with our student trans community, and what they feel very strikingly, and to my mind quite worryingly, is that sense of victimhood. You know, that it's not necessarily a joyous thing to be a trans student. It's a very difficult thing that you have to work through. And I think we as institutions have a real responsibility to understand that and to try and be as supportive to it as we possibly can be. But where that takes us is, I think you're right, that in terms of sort of identity politics, generationally, there is something of a shift taking place where people actually find there to be something quite exhilarating about not having to define yourself in absolute binary terms. And I think the role of universities and higher education in this, as often in the case in terms of society as a whole, is to give some space to that. I'm not sure, frankly, that any of us know where this is going to go. My own view is that we'll probably end up with, in parlance, a much more mixed economy of people who do feel very rather more fluidly about their gender, but also people who feel very strongly that they are one thing or the other, but that as we normalize this, we'll become more tolerant and accepting of it. We're probably at the peak difficult phase, I would say, at the moment. But I am very clear that our role as universities and institutions has to be to enable that conversation and to encourage it to go where it needs to go.
Just to add to that, I'd agree that universities should be the kind of like ideal and safest space to talk about these issues and to have honest conversations about them. And I think whether we're talking about support for people who identify as women, whether they identify as non-binary, I think the important thing is just to make sure that everyone feels seen. They feel seen and they feel heard. And not to generalise, but I think some of the interventions that we've been talking about and some of the support will be quite similar, whether you identify as a woman, as non-binary. For example, mentoring and coaching, actually giving that one-to-one personalised, and that's what personalised support is, to understand actually those issues and understand what someone might be going through as they realise that they want to identify as non-binary, perhaps rather than a woman, for example. That the positive impact of those interventions could be just as powerful.
Yes, Cliff was my tutor too, actually. I would say that we've been talking about the way in which personal support and mentorship turns out to be really crucial. And in the college which I'm associated with, we've actually now moved along from not only, obviously I think in Wadham there's a lot of support now for undergraduates, there are advisors for postgraduates, we're now moving towards thinking of allocating mentors to postdocs, so that there's a constant sense of people helping each other up the system. And of course that is applicable to men and to women, and it helps both in their careers. You asked about what possible really radical interventions one could introduce. It seems to me that a system which is supportive and constantly inviting people to fulfill their potential at the best moment for them and in the best way for them runs counter to what, in my experience of the last 50 years, has become an extremely managerial model of university life, where there is a constant question, demands for accountability and evaluation of achievements in the statistical terms. So let me appeal to Sally finally to abolish the RAE-REF, which is both fantastically stressful and particularly, I think, stressful for people in mid-career, perhaps women who have trying to juggle the life-work balance. It's fantastically expensive, it's fantastically time-consuming, and it's completely pointless. Thank you.
Alas, my powers only extend so far, and they don't extend to doing away with the ref. I do actually very strongly agree that we should be trying to get to a situation. I regard mentoring as extremely empowering. I don't for a moment ever think of it as in any way remedial. And I think that is a really important point to make, because there's still that sense that, if you need mentoring, you're in some way making up a deficit. Actually, far from it. You're just kind of bringing out the best of yourself. But has academia got sort of over bureaucratic? Emphatically it has, and we're all endlessly accounting for things we don't need to account for. I completely agree with that, and I think that one of the most powerful interventions right across the piece would be to build more trust into the system and less kind of endless box filling, and to take out those layers of it and sort of get back to what we're supposed to be about. Do I think that's going to happen? Alas, I don't. I think there'll be attempts to kind of rationalise and help institutions to do less of it. But unfortunately, I think there's a sort of industry involved in this now, and a lot, if you like, of vested interests. I'm constantly astonished by how much swimming around academia, how many organisms there are, agencies, bodies that are all on the back of what we are essentially doing. So the vested interests are not just those of government, they've actually got highly privatised now.
When we started the Women's Studies course, we called ourselves a committee because we knew that the universities loved committees. And so we were the committee to oversee the course in Women's Studies. But actually we didn't meet very often, and we behaved entirely in a non-committee sort of way. And I think that would be the ideal, go under the cover of being a committee.
Well, just briefly, sorry, Ursula. I think also we're not in an equal enough society where we don't need to take risks yet. So this isn't specific to the ref, but also like whether it's an undergraduate, whether it's an academic post, whether it's a vice-chancellor, if on paper you've got a great candidate who isn't quite there on paper, but they've got the potential, compared to the polished product. What's wrong with going with the one who's got potential and give them that mentoring to bring out that potential, not to address a deficit, like Sally said? What's wrong with that? I mean, I'm a good example of that. I think my tutor was Paul Martin, who's not here because I think he thinks I'm so empowered now, he's a bit scared of me. But you know, he said actually openly a while after I graduated that I was a contextual offer, and that on paper I didn't have good grades because I went to a bad state school, and that on paper there were much better candidates, but he could see a lot of potential, and the college actually had a responsibility to take a chance and bring out that potential in me than to take another student that looked like everyone else at the time. And I think he made a good decision. So. Yeah. Sorry, Ursula.
Yes, well, yes. For people who aren't as up to date with university acronyms as some of us, what the RAE is, it's a kind of national beauty competition, but which requires universities to submit a portfolio of stuff, which is then judged and ranked. I blame spreadsheets myself. It's all Bill Gates' fault, but but it does have a debilitating effect precisely when it becomes more and more managerial and more, you know, they never take away burdens. It's always an extra burden. Oh, look, now we're going to be rated on this thing. So we all want you to fill in a monthly report on this thing, on a stupid piece of software that doesn't bloody work. And people do feel down by it. People do feel, and they do, you know, there's always a manager somewhere you can blame for this. But I think it is, going back to your point about, and Sally's point about mentoring, it's extremely unfortunate that sometimes, you know, it's the language of HR and so on, it all gets tangled up, you know. Helping someone to achieve peak potential, you know, is jargon for let's put them through an utterly demeaning and horrible process, rather than the kind of constructive, kind, helpful mentoring that we're talking about, and many of us, including me, have benefited from in the past.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question, and then we'll have to close the session. I think there was a question there, yes.
Thank you very much for sharing all your personal reflections so openly. In the late 80s, we also had a student women's committee, and we had a lot of fun together, but it fell under the student union and worked together with the women's officer, which we also felt was necessary. Then I hope there's no women's officer anymore, but I hear there's still a women's tutor. But my question to you is more about what can we do? What role do you see for alumni in terms of interventions?
That's a really good question and offer. I mean, I think the intergenerational conversations, if you like, that we're having now are really important. And I think in terms of mentoring and offering advice and comparative, you know, points of comparison, and opportunities to current students, for example, to talk to somebody who's had a different experience, or maybe even, I mean, we do have wonderful alumni who offer support for students, you know, offering them internships or helping them to, you know, figure out what moves to make, you know, in terms of career planning. So, I mean, I think any of that sort of activity is just wonderful. I mean, not least because it's rewarding for everybody concerned, you know, but I think it is something that would bind the college together as well as an intergenerational, as I was saying, you know, sort of lived history, as it were, you know, a community that actually works as a community, and I think that would be wonderful, and it would also help to, I think, underline the variety of ways in which you can be successful as well, because I think that's part of the point about power and people's self-esteem and sense of what they're doing in their lives, that there are just so many different ways of measuring that. And you know, part of perhaps thinking about power differently would also relate to how we think about contributions to the world differently. So, I mean, the more, the merrier, I'd have thought.
Indeed, what a lovely note to end on. So I want to thank this wonderful panel for their insights, and I think that, if we were just taking this in isolation, we would say, actually, in 50 years, so much has been achieved. And to come back to the point that Jane was making earlier, how much more can be achieved in the next 50 years, is that I think what we need to take away. I mean, women's voices are now heard. Women are more visible, they occupy more space, there is more critical mass. There are still challenges, and a lot of challenges are to do with intersectionality as well. And we've begun to sketch out a few ideas about past interventions and future interventions. So I'll leave you to mingle. So I think you have a free half hour, believe it or not, and then I think we will reconvene in the graduate centre, undergraduate centre, sorry, for canapes and music, I believe. So thank you very much, and drinks. Yeah.